I've drawn on Trove newspapers, on historical newspapers, quite strongly, quite heavily in putting together this talk, Skirts on Fire. And the way I posed a question myself about Skirts on Fire was the last movie I saw before the original COVID shutdown was this one, Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Now, because of that title, obviously, I was on the alert whenever there was a naked flame. And being set in the 18th century, there were plenty of those. There were candles, open fireplaces, and of course all these trailing frocks. And you're just waiting for someone to catch a light. Finally, in the movie, there's this witchy sort of ritual on the beach, and with lots of women in their trailing frocks, and one of them strays a little close to the edge of the fire and kind of lingers there in a bit of a trance, and the hem of her skirt catches alight. But rather than blazing up, it just kind of does this slow smoulder, giving someone plenty of time to stamp out the flames. And when I saw this, I thought to myself, having read in Trove newspapers many and many a time, headlines like this: horrible death by fire, dreadful death by burning, terrible fire accident, and so on. I thought this was pretty lame, and I kind of scoffed to myself at the inauthenticity of this movie. But I did some more reading and found that a calamitous dress fire usually had less to do with the flame than with the dress it encountered. You'll notice the bottom headline in my list there, this is a bit of a furphy from me, is nothing to do with skirts. It says dangerous pencil holder, and I just couldn't resist throwing this in. It was a report from the Mount Alexander Mail in 1873 of a girl who found what she took to be a tin pencil holder on her way home from school. And when she got home, she took a piece of slate pencil and poked it in there, and the thing exploded and took off the ends of two fingers, and she ended up with shrapnel in her face, and it was a supposed charge of dynamite powder, probably something to do with the railways, I'd expect. But this was the kind of thing that could happen even if your skirt didn't catch on fire. It was a tricky time for anybody, the 19th century. Now, up till the 19th century, getting back to flames and skirts, most clothing was made of linen or wool. These were sturdy, long-wearing fabrics, and they were pretty flame-resistant. In the Georgian period, there were those lightweight muslin frocks, like the lasses in our picture here, worn by Jane Austen characters that we're kind of familiar with. And the style of those frocks, the Empire line, made them more fitted than floaty in shape. So even though it was fine muslin that they were made of, it didn't kind of trail and catch alight as easily as some of the later bigger frocks. And the layers worn underneath were still likely to be made of linen or wool, given that the frocks were so thin, you wanted to warm yourself up a bit with what was underneath. So that too would have deterred their flammability. But with the growth of industrialisation in the early 19th century, cotton became the go-to fabric for women's clothing. It was relatively cheap and came in a variety of weights, colours and prints. Plus, compared to wool especially, it was easy to launder. This was no small thing. And did I mention too, it was cheap. Another thing about cotton though was its high degree of flammability compared to those old fabrics. Now, during the 1840s, largely due to this booming industry in cotton, fashion dictated bigger and bigger and wider skirts. Metres and metres of them, undergirded with layers of petticoats, including one that was made of linen, stiffened, would you believe, with horsehair. One would hope it wasn't worn next to the skin. And that layer was called crinoline. Crin, by way of French from the Latin for hair, and lin from linen. The skirts got even bigger in the 1850s. But don't get the idea that this meant that women's clothes were loose and comfortable, even though you might be able to see in the picture here that the sleeves and the jacket are quite loose, but underneath they still had those layers of stays and corsets that held the figure tight. Those billowing skirts, I suspect, were meant to emphasise or maybe even to sort of satirise the idea of childbearing hips. And of course, all the padding it took to keep those skirts aloft got more and more hot and uncomfortable and toilsome. Now, one solution that was tried, I think almost in jest, was the inflatable crinoline. I don't know whether you can make it out, but there's a pair of bellows here pumping up this crinoline. I also think there's a bit of whimsy involved in this image, because I think the inflatable crinoline was, the inflatable bits I suspect were more like kind of saddlebags or panniers that were worn underneath that would have puffed it up like this, like balloons. But anyway, this is the general idea. I can't remember even where I was up to. But anyway, in a Tasmanian paper, they relayed an account that came from Europe, presumably, of a lady at her first Paris soiree, a young English lady. It highlighted the kind of thing that could go wrong with your inflatable crinoline. It was headed "Explosion of a Lady." The first time she sat down, a formidable noise startled all the people present, and the lady sprang to her feet flat as a balloon collapsed. She did not lose her presence of mind, however, she said tranquilly, "Oh, that is nothing. It's only my mécanique that is deranged." I just realised that my mécanique is deranged by having this mask on. Sorry, folks. Of course, the crinoline was, as in the case of this illustration, fashion's gift to humorists and moralists alike. A cage crinoline, which took the place of the air crinoline, was supposedly more comfortable than the old layers of horsehair, because it was made of light steel springs suspended from cotton tapes, and they started off with a small one at the hips, which grew bigger and bigger as they neared the hem. Of course, there's still been a layer or two of petticoats separating the crinoline and the wearer. But this, for all its comparative comfort, it inevitably took up a lot of space in shops, in ballrooms, of course, workplaces, and in domestic settings, as well as on public footpaths. And just imagine trying to wrangle one into a seat in a theatre or a carriage. Here's a crinoline here called the Cage Crinoline, and here was what someone imagined they would like to do with that cage, as far as the critics of the crinoline were concerned. Here is the crinoline itself, an exploded or an X-ray vision view, the X-ray specs version. You can see exactly how it was constructed with those 4 rings in that instance. And here's, I think, a humorous photographic rendering of how one was put on. It looks like a maidservant had to kind of manipulate it with enormous chopsticks, or perhaps a pair of wicket stumps to get it over the lass's head. But here we are. Here's someone walking down the aisle in the church, knocking all the hats which were kept at the end of the pews, knocking them, if not their wearers, for 6 on her way. And honestly, if someone had set out to design the most ignitable costume possible, the crinoline's what they would have come up with. The skirt itself tended to be of light flyaway stuff, either muslin or open weave variations, like gauze, or ones they called bobinette and tarlatan. And all of them were cotton, of course, with a layer or more of those petticoats. Together, they created what was essentially a funnel for fire. And added to the danger was the fact the crinoline extended the skirt so far from its wearer that she'd have been unaware of what was happening at the outer reaches. All too often, a woman would have her back to the stove or to an open fire, or brush against a candle and be alight before she knew it. There's some ladies at the theatre, and here we have a woman on fire, and there's one who looks like she has been standing in front of the fire. Look, have a look at this. One is a take. Oh no, one is not a take on the other. I have another photo somewhere that has that same chap in it. I think it may have been the one that we saw here when we came in, that had that same epauletted rescuer in the doorway. So that was obviously this was a spoof on that one, I suspect. In the medical journal The Lancet in 1860, we read, "Another death by fire" as a common heading by which modern readers are familiarised with the almost daily holocaust of women sacrificed by the combustibility of their dress and the expansion of the crinoline. This Lancet article put the number of fire fatalities in Britain the previous year at more than 3,000, but it's pretty doubtful that they were all crinoline related. According to a report from the Times of London in 1863, of 28 cases of death by burning that had come before one coroner, 18 were caused by clothes catching fire. And as it said, as we know that woolen fabrics never do catch fire, we may presume with some certainty that all the 18 victims were women. So we're thinking of men, obviously not just being dressed in closer fitting clothing, but in clothes mainly of wool. It was certainly true in Australia too, that the newspapers regularly carried these stories of fire fatalities for which the crinoline was held to blame. So in a typical report from January 1863, we read that a most lamentable occurrence resulting in loss of life took place in Carlton on Saturday afternoon at the residence of Mr. Lucas, printer. His daughter, a fine young girl of about 18 years, was leaning over the fire to lift some vessel off when a light muslin dress she had on, which was rendered still more flammable by the usual accompaniment of crinoline, caught fire and she was soon ablaze. Her brother, who was in the next room, heard her cry, rushed to her assistance and laying hold of a tablecloth, wrapped it about her. However, the poor girl was so frightfully burned that even her stays were found burning. In case the reader had missed it, the moral of the story was hammered home. If the ladies of Melbourne do not take warning from the above with respect to their unlimited use of crinoline, of the deadly crinoline, nothing will suffice to impress them. In the early 60s, the fashionable skirt silhouette changed to a flatter front with the crinoline projecting more so at the back, but still out of sight, out of mind. From Beechworth, Victoria in 1863, we read a young married woman named Anna Kirby who suffered severe injuries through her crinoline being too extensive. She was engaged in ironing, her back being towards the fire, and in stooping over her work, her clothes came in contact with the flames. And at Ararat in 1864, another crinoline accident. A lady was standing with her back to an almost extinct fire, engaged in some domestic business, when the cracking of a stick cast a spark on the thin muslin frock she wore. She heard a noise like a rush of flames and on turning round perceived the back portion of her skirts were on fire. Happily, however, a current of air was flowing from the dress up the chimney. Now, I don't know what that's about unless she had on one of those inflatable crinolines which had burst. Else it was probable the whole of the skirts would have caught. Two relatives of the lady were standing a short distance off and observing the danger, they threw her down without any ceremony and succeeded by compressing those portions of the dress which had caught fire and getting it extinguished before any injury was sustained, beyond a slight bruising occasioned by the necessarily rough handling to which she was subjected. But by far the majority of reported dress fires did result in death. The dress fire to end all dress fires took place in Philadelphia, US, in 1861. The Gale Sisters, there were 4 of them, Ruth, Zela, Hannah and Adeline, were part of the corps de ballet, dressing for their dance in the second act of Shakespeare's Tempest at the Continental Theatre. Ruth's fine gauze ballet dress caught fire from a gas jet in the dressing room, and her sisters, when they came to her aid, they caught fire too. In their panic, they ran to the room next door where 8 more ballerinas were getting dressed. Their costumes too caught alight, and in a state of extraordinary terror, some of them leapt from the windows into the street. And here's a quote. Miss Zela Gale, who had first run to her unhappy sister and whose whole dress was speedily in a blaze, fled shrieking down the stairs towards the stage. The stage carpenter wrenched up the cloth, which represented the sea in the last scene of the first act, and wrapped her in it, extinguishing the flames. 7 of the ballerinas died of their injuries, victims, as one journalist put it, to managerial economy. This alluded to the fact that responsible theatre owners took measures to guard against accidents like this. They kept damp blankets and buckets of water ready backstage, and footlights were covered in glass. In London, also in 1861, there was a poor ballet girl named Miss Smith who died after her costume caught a spark from one of the fire pans placed on stage to produce coloured lights. Although her death was ruled accidental, The Times of London pointed out how, in this case too, safety measures had been neglected by theatre management, including that her outer skirt, instead of being chemically prepared to resist flame, was of common muslin and blazed accordingly. So clothing could be made fire resistant to an extent by steeping it in what they called some anti-volcanic preparation, a solution either of sulphate of ammonia or, better still, tungstate of soda, marketed as the lady's life preserver. This is the more practicable, said the Times, if, as we are credibly informed, the finest of these muslins never comes into the hands of the laundress. In other words, it was never washed. In French theatres, such fireproofing measures had been mandatory since 1859, but some performers still chose to take the risk rather than have their costumes made yellow and stiff by these chemical salts. It is difficult, said the Lancet, to awaken the mind to the necessity of providing against contingencies which are distant and uncertain. Until the moment of catastrophe, nothing seems more unlikely than that it should occur. Nevertheless, all ranks have furnished their quota to the number of victims. Princesses, countesses, court ladies, ballet girls, the decrepit and the young, rich and poor. And it was true, the Royal Laundry was under orders to treat all sheer fabrics with tungstate of soda ever since Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, Vicky, the Princess Royal, while melting wax to seal a letter, set the sleeve of her gauze dress alight, badly burning her arm. You can see what she's got on there. It's certainly not gauze, but it does have very wide sleeves. You can imagine how easily that would trail into the flame of a candle. And here we have someone from quite a later era, I think, but nonetheless, she's busy looking at the door, not at the candle or the wax. And you can see how that could lead to calamity. That article from the Times of London that I quoted and was syndicated in newspapers all around Australia was headed "Fireproof Dresses." It argued that just because the essence of fashion is so volatile, the clothes themselves needn't be. And there was a facetious tone to this, I have to say. We do not deny that to set off their figures to advantage should be the supreme object of the larger half of the human race. But we want to point out how devotion to this object may be shown at a cost less than the daily risk of martyrdom. They instanced the momentary contact of a light dress with the fire, the fall of a live ember onto a combustible fringe, and summed up, on the one side is the paramount right of women to self-government in respect of the form of dress, subject only to the transcendent jurisdiction of fashion. On the other is the right of husbands, fathers and guardians to protect themselves against domestic auto-da-fe. There is but one way of avoiding a collision between these interests, and that is for the ladies to adopt fireproof garments with a good grace. The simmering disgruntlement of these husbands, fathers and guardians was elaborated in a piece that was in the London Evening News, a daily news, reprinted in the Sydney Morning Herald in 1861 under the heading, "Crinoline, a real social evil." During these 5 years, it said, we have done our best to be patient under an evil which we hoped would be short-lived. We've had no comfort in social meetings because no dinner table and no ballroom, no box or stall at the theatre could accommodate both our families and ourselves. Nor have we had room to turn ourselves around in our own homes. We have found it disagreeable and difficult to walk with our wives and daughters on pavements and country footpaths. We've seen the choicest flowers in our gardens, the most cherished plants in our greenhouses cut off by the hoop. We've paid a fare and a half for each wife and daughter in travelling on a coach, and have lost all our pleasure on board steamboats from the anxiety of watching lest any of our party should sweep a child over into the lake or river. Now, I haven't actually found any accounts of children being knocked into the sea or under a carriage wheel by a mother or nursemaids swaying crinoline. I have found this, though, which presents the crinoline as a possible playground for children. I like that one. I suspect it was just fear-mongering, like the child supposedly stuck in the eye by their mother's hatpin 50 years later. I have read accounts of women blown into the sea and drowned after the wind caught hold of their crinoline skirt. Another woman was dragged along after a horse, and this is hard to say, caught its hoof in her hoop. And there were apocryphal, I'm pretty sure they were apocryphal stories of women pulled by the hoops under carriage wheels and crushed. At least one woman died when her crinoline was struck by lightning. Remember, those were steel hoops. There were even, one journalist claimed, cases of actual disembowelings from the gashes inflicted by broken steel hoops. Needless to say, there was a moral aspect to all this commentary. If self-preservation or the feelings of the breadwinner weren't reason enough to forswear the crinoline, then how about the grave effect on the morals, sense and taste of the maidservants? Because following the fashionable example of their betters, servants, of course, adopted crinolines too. Looks like in this case she had but one hoop to her mistress's 3 or 4. An 1860 survey of 150 girls in an English school, most of them destined to be domestic servants, scarcely one of them had a pocket handkerchief, researchers found, and scarcely one had not a hoop. What a prospect before them, the report said. The cook could not pursue her business without incessant personal danger. The housemaid may meet the fate of other housemaids and be burnt to death upon the hearth. And the nursemaid is, again, more than likely to push some one of the children off a footbridge or a riverside path or into the road. And you might not think it, but I think you can get a clue from this image. A crinoline could be a terrifically immodest garment. Florence Nightingale, no less, deplored the indecency which she felt sure most crinoline wearers were oblivious to. A respectable woman, stooping forward, invested of crinoline, she wrote, exposes quite as much of her own person as any opera dancer does on the stage. You can imagine if that lady there bent much further forward, the chap behind her would get an eyeful. See, when you bent forward or sat down, your crinoline hoops were liable to tilt up, lifting the hem of your skirt to head height. There's a couple of other instances. Same if a gust of wind got underneath. But on the plus side, the crinoline did let women take up more space in the world. And it was said that many were grateful for the buffer that it put between them and would-be gropers. The name crinoline would later be adopted for a kind of netting that was put around ships to deter damage from torpedoes. So I think we can see a parallel there. A too close encounter with a crinoline in a situation such as this resulted in the death of the Mayor of St Kilda, James Turner, in 1867. He was walking along, said the newspaper, when his foot accidentally caught in the steel hoops of a lady's dress and he fell heavily, sustaining a compound fracture of the leg. Infection set in, no penicillin, and that was it for James Turner, the only man that I read about killed by a crinoline, or at least directly killed by a crinoline, because there was some talk of crinolines having contributed to the fatal disarray of the Burke and Wills expedition. The upshot being that women in steel hoop crinolines promenading too close to the observatory on Flagstaff Hill in Melbourne upset the magnetic readings and threw the explorers' compasses out of whack, which were being set there in preparation. I think that's taken away too much responsibility from Robert O'Hara Burke. But then in 1863, at the height of the bushranging scourge in the Riverina, so there was Dan Morgan, John Gilbert, Ben Hall, just to name a few who were at large at that time, the Wagga Wagga Express ran a story headed, "Crinoline Useful at Last." Yes, it is a fact, and the originator of the idea, Sub-Inspector Morrow, deserves great credit for his ready ingenuity. It appears that while at Bethungra is between Junee and Cootamundra, while at Bethungra with his party in search of the bushrangers, the telegraph wire was broken down. Bringing the broken ends of the wires as near together as possible, he restored the communication with the metal from a crinoline obtained for the purpose. Obtained from where, one wonders. It does put me in mind of a feature of Peter Carey's True History of the Kelly Gang, reproduced also in the movie a couple of years ago of the same book, which involved the cross-dressing bushrangers. A crinoline may in fact have been on one of those bushmen pursuing them even, who's to say. By the end of the 1860s, the crinoline had pretty much had its day. Skirts weren't so voluminous, but light cotton fabrics with multiple petticoats and the ubiquity of naked flames still continued to make women's lives a lottery. There's a housemaid, relaxing, but, disaster is just a spark away. And here we've got a tin, which I found just recently in an op shop. You can see it's an elderly woman using the bellows on her kitchen fire. She has her trailing apron and a skirt right down to her ankles. And again, disaster could be not far away. I noticed that around the edge of the tin, the flames are licking up towards her. So I think there's a hint there. It had Sweet Acres toffees inside it, so that was the happy side of that story. Right up until the First World War, I mean, aprons in particular continued long and used to sort of fly around in all weathers. You'd find a steady supply of headlines like the ones we saw before, and it wasn't just indoors. This was the problem. In the bush or in hot weather, meals were cooked out of doors, and clothes were often washed on a copper heated over a backyard fire. All it took was that same trailing hem or apron, a gust of wind or a spark, and whoosh. And every account tells of how the unfortunate woman, once she realised her skirt was on fire, how she would run and rush for help, which was only natural, but still the worst thing she could have done, all that running and rushing, just fanning the flames. At Stanthorpe in Queensland, 1875, the wife of a baker was engaged in cooking dinner at a fire outside at the rear of a shop. It was just in the act of taking off a saucepan when the blaze caught the skirt of her, again, light muslin dress, and finding herself unable to extinguish it, she rushed to a large tank a few yards distant with the intention of plunging into the water, but from the height of the tank was unable to do so, immediately rushed back into the bakehouse, enveloped in flames. She'd been married just a few months. She was just 17 when she died. And in Sydney, on Christmas Day in 1890, a widow was cooking dinner on a fire in the yard when her skirts caught alight. Her screams attracted the attention of her daughter, who tore the skirts from her, but the fire had gained a hold of the underclothing, made, of course, of cotton. And there were the celebrity victims. We saw Princess Victoria before. The Archduchess Matilde of Austria was 18 years old, and she was betrothed to the King of Italy when she hid a cigarette behind her back. Her father disapproved of her smoking, and she set her skirt on fire and died. Fanny Longfellow, wife of the American poet, met with an accident just like the one the Princess Royal had suffered. She trimmed her young daughter's hair, and she wanted to keep a few locks as a keepsake. She popped them in an envelope, and as she melted wax to seal it, a few drops of burning wax fell in her lap. There was a breeze from the open window, fanning the flames. Her husband rushed into the room and badly burned his face and hands, trying to stifle the fire. Well, she died, and Longfellow grew that long sage-like beard to hide his scars. In England, in 1883, Tina Rochford-Smith, a gifted Shakespeare scholar and a contributor to the Oxford English Dictionary, she contributed the definition to the word airtight. And interestingly, a fire can't burn in an airtight container, but that's beside the point. She was burning letters, probably from her married lover, when she struck a match of the bad kind called domestics. The lighted head flew off onto a needlework mat which caught fire. She threw it down and stamped on it, but didn't notice that her dress had caught fire behind. From that, the lace curtains caught. She tried at first to put them out and then her own clothes, but failing, she rushed downstairs into the garden where, when they'd nearly burnt themselves out, the flames were at last extinguished. Tina died 6 days later. It could happen that easily, just with a bad match. without going too deep into the history of matches, let's just say that in the 19th century they were a pretty unstable technology. You can see a matchbox there like the one I have in my hand. It's made of tin or metal and has the Vespers inside. The problem was, of course, the reason for the tin was that they could set fire to themselves and one another by just rattling against one another in the box, because there were friction matches. You've seen blokes in old films lighting their matches on the sole of their shoes. And it was a tin a little like this, only I suspect a bit smaller and circular, that is cylindrical, that was favoured by gold diggers in Ballarat and elsewhere during the gold rush for storing their gold. They knew that roughly 1 ounce of fine gold would fill what they called a matchbox. It took me a long time to pin down what one of those looked like, but it was a cylindrical box like that, only probably made of cardboard, and it held 1 ounce of gold once they burned all those matches. So Tina's bad domestics, the head would fly off when you struck it. That happened to me just yesterday, so I know it's a thing. At the turn of the 20th century, the commonest culprit in clothing fires was this, flannelette. It was warm, fleecy cotton. It seemed perfect for winter petticoats and night dresses, but it proved to be the most flammable of flammable fabrics. A typical news report might say, as she wore an underskirt of flannelette, it was a matter of very little time before the unfortunate victim was traditionally enveloped in flames. Flame-proofing products such as Dr. Perkins non-flam specifically targeted flannelette, and of course this was the stuff that most children's nightwear was made of. It would be the 1950s before laws began to be passed internationally that mandated flammability standards in the garment industry, and flannelette nightwear was one of their first targets. Now, speaking of the garment industry, you may have heard of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York in 1911, in which 123 female garment workers were killed. Just as cotton clothing was a fire risk in the home, so it was in the manufacturing process. The accumulation of fluff and the hot machinery combined with the fabric itself, all housed in multi-storied buildings with timber floors and crowded with hundreds of workers, most of them women, themselves of course dressed in bulky cotton garments. It was a tinderbox. The Triangle Shirtwaist fire drew belated attention to these conditions, with one result being the appointment of Sarah Christopher as New York's first female fire inspector. She proved astute at spotting safety infringements, especially men smoking in garment factories. And in less than a year, she'd imposed fines worth more than 4 times what the city was paying her. More importantly, she ran a fire drill in every factory, showing factory girls, more than 100,000 of them, how to escape in the event of a fire. Not only had Mrs. Christophers found that the deaths and injuries caused in factory fires were more often from panic than from burning, but she'd also discovered, she said, that the average woman has a dread of the fire escape, which is usually a caged ladder running down the outside of the building. Before she would run a drill, she'd usually test the fire escape herself, showing the girls how it was done. She herself wore a bifurcated riding skirt, which I guess looked like a skirt but was really pants. And she became an unlikely champion of what was just then the much berated hobble skirt. It was all the fashion. Now the hobble skirt, or also called the mummy skirt, was ankle length, but from the knees downwards it narrowed dramatically, causing the wearer to be effectively hobbled, taking these short tottering steps. Now the hobble skirt created, if it's possible, even more hilarity and disapproval in the newspapers than the crinoline had done, as well as headlines like "Hobble Skirt, Terrible Death." On that occasion, a girl named Elsie Ford, who worked in the Arnott's Biscuit factory in Homebush in Sydney, on her way home from work one afternoon, fell under a train when she attempted to jump from one carriage to the next, wearing a hobble skirt. In a news report from the US, we read that on the Pennsylvania railways, during just 3 months in 1911, 73 cases of injury were attributed to hobble skirts, but the railway company says it is helpless to prevent these accidents because women of all times have followed styles dangerous to life and limb. That same year, 1911, we read in the Melbourne Herald of a report from Sydney of a bull breaking loose on the docks and running amok through city streets, and they said amusement was caused by the dilemma women and girls wearing hobble skirts were placed in. Some, owing to the restrictive skirt impeding their hasty motion, fell on the roadways and had to be assisted to their feet by male rescuers. But Sarah Christopher, that New York fire inspector, she would find that the hobble skirt was ideal for navigating the fire escape, since it had no trailing folds and no unnecessary material upon which the descending woman might trip. Now, before we finish with the subject of women and fires, I can't resist sharing this with you. Oh, not that, that's actually my supplementary hobble skirt. I love pictures that I find from historic sources that look like women on mobile phones. And that is an example from a 1914 or 12 advertisement for fashions. But there you go. They were reading books, I think, probably small hymn books in church. So, sharing this with you, it was 1890 and the newly opened Palace Hotel in Bourke Street, Melbourne. It was 7 stories high. It had a roller skating rink on the roof. It was plagued by a serial arsonist who lit small fires throughout the hotel at all hours of the day and especially at night. In one instance, a guest returning to his locked room found his bed on fire. Who is the clumsy incendiary? Asked the newspapers. Though no one had yet been killed or even injured by these fires, an inquest was mounted to investigate. There had been deaths caused the previous year when the neighbouring Bijou Theatre was gutted by fire, and there was a strong suggestion that the same culprit were responsible for both. So the city coroner, together with a posse of journalists, took a tour of the hotel. This was the layout of the first floor, I think, inspecting the site of every outbreak. And the Herald gave this report. As spot after spot is visited, one cannot but be impressed with the clumsiness of the attempts. In fact, the coroner rapidly reaches the opinion that the fire fiend is a woman afflicted with fire disease. He thinks a man who wanted to burn the hotel down would have done so in 1/4 of the attempts. And women's association with fire goes a long way back. Here is Pandora opening her box in a mural on the wall of the East Melbourne Fire Station in Melbourne. So a man was eventually found responsible for the Palace Hotel fires and probably the Bijou Theatre fire too. His name was Oswald Twist, the Palace Hotel's night porter and bootblack. But he mustn't really have wanted to burn the hotel down by the coroner's reasoning, but only to singe it a little. Otherwise, he would have been successful on his first attempt. And of course, what the coroner didn't say, but surely knew almost better than anyone, was that a female arsonist would likely have died in her own fire from setting her clothes alight. But let us, like all those crinoline wearers, put fire behind us. I want to end with a piece from the Sydney Evening News in 1912 that turns the tables on male critics of female fashions. We've heard a great deal lately, it begins, about the dangers of hobble skirts, and men are very fond of telling their women friends that female fashions are ruinous to the health. But if doctors are to be believed, men indulge in many fashions that are quite as harmful. So there was a report coming out of England at that time that doctors had studied the effects on men of their fashion choices. Probably the most dangerous article of clothing worn by men, said the report, is the tight collar. Besides being very bad for the eyes, not quite sure how that worked, collars do not allow sufficient room for that do not allow sufficient room for the neck have also been accused of producing baldness. A well-known London doctor stated recently in the British Medical Journal that he enlarged his neckwear and my hair not only became darker but grew profusely where I had previously been bald. His explanation is that tight collars impede the communication between heart and brain and materially affect the proper circulation of the blood. And these collars of unusual height that we can see in the illustration here, that were all the rage just then, was said to cause numbness in the head and laboured breathing. And it gets worse. Same article under the subhead, Perils of Coloured Footwear, we read, the great popularity of coloured socks has probably caused the deaths of many men from blood poisoning, due entirely to the dyes used in coloured footwear. A blister may very easily get poisoned if allowed to come in contact with a coloured sock, and unless speedy steps are taken, death may result. The colours most likely to run and take the wearer's feet were bright red and the most popular colour just then with young men of today, purple. If you must wear coloured socks, doctors urged, make sure they have undyed feet. And I guess that's why footy socks have traditionally had white feet and coloured legs, because of the dangers posed to blistered feet by those coloured dyes. And then, same article, there were the dress suit victims. Few men, said the Evening News, quoting a medico as saying, realise they are very liable to catch cold while wearing evening dress. The open, expansive shirt front worn on a chilly evening is very likely to give a man pneumonia. Now, of course, when he said open shirt front, he didn't mean literally an open shirt front. This was 1912, not 1972. Only that it wasn't covered by a waistcoat or a high button jacket like men's shirt fronts would normally have been. When a man went out in a dress suit, he ought to wear thicker underwear. But not one man in 100, said the doctor, ever thinks of this. So a night out at the club, the theatre, you catch a chill and boom, dead before you know it. And did one man in 100 give so much as a thought to his wife and children when he hitched his trousers high? Even though, as anyone could tell you, and the Evening News did, that tight braces contracted the chest and could bring on consumption, not to mention the dreaded camel toe. And that, I'm going to leave it there with the dangers and embarrassments, really, of men's clothing.